Johnny Whitaker's journey in Hollywood began long before he understood what fame truly meant. Born John Orson Whitaker Jr. on December 13, 1959, in Van Nuys, California, he entered show business at an age when most children were just learning to form full sentences. By the time he was 3, he was already appearing in commercials, his natural expressiveness and emotional clarity drawing attention from directors and audiences alike. His early performances were genuine and unforced, capturing a kind of innocence that audiences immediately connected to. This rare emotional authenticity would shape not only his early career, but also the bond he would form with actor Brian Keith years later. His breakthrough came in 1966 with the CBS sitcom Family Affair, where he played Jody Davis, one of 3 orphan siblings placed under the guardianship of a wealthy uncle in New York City. The role required a blend of vulnerability and quiet resilience, and Johnny delivered exactly that. His portrayal struck a chord with viewers because it felt real, not exaggerated, not rehearsed, but sincere. The 5-year run of Family Affair, from 1966 to 1971, turned him into one of the most recognizable young actors in American television. On screen, Brian Keith played Uncle Bill, stern, reserved, emotionally guarded but deeply caring. Off-screen, the relationship between Keith and Whitaker mirrored that dynamic closely. Johnny was just 7 years old when filming began, navigating a working environment dominated by adults and schedules he barely understood. Brian instinctively stepped into a protective, guiding role. He was not a man known for grand emotional displays, but his care was unmistakable. He taught Johnny how to break down scenes, understand emotional context, and believe the words rather than simply recite them, advice Whitaker would carry for life. Brian Keith was known in Hollywood for being a disciplined professional with a commanding presence. But to Johnny, Keith represented something more personal: stability. Hollywood in the late 1960s was an industry built on performance, image, and contractual responsibility, not emotional safety for child actors. Many young performers were treated like commodities. Johnny later explained that Brian was different. He spoke to him patiently, explained scripts line by line, and often checked him privately to make sure he was handling the pressures well. He wasn't just helping him perform, he was teaching him how to survive in an environment that had broken many child actors before him. As Family Affair continued, the bond between the two deepened. Their natural chemistry translated into scenes that never felt artificial. Viewers saw a believable family dynamic because that connection was rooted in reality. Johnny later described Brian not simply as a mentor but as a second father, someone whose presence made the overwhelming reality of early fame bearable. When the series ended in 1971, Johnny was still young, but his fame continued. He transitioned into film work, something many child actors struggled to do. He starred in The Biscuit Eater and Tom Sawyer, showing remarkable emotional range and proving that his talent extended well beyond a single role. Yet even during this success, the lessons from Brian remained with him: discipline, emotional honesty, and the need to ground performance in truth rather than theatrics. But life after childhood success brought unavoidable challenges. Hollywood did not provide a roadmap for the transition from child actor to adult identity. Johnny's personal life became increasingly complex, and without the structured environment of regular filming and Brian's grounding presence, he struggled to hold on to the stability he once had on set. His later marriage to Simria Wright represented an attempt to find peace and grounding away from the public eye, but internal struggles and unresolved pressures caused strain that ultimately led to separation. Throughout these difficulties, Johnny often reflected on Brian Keith's strength. Brian himself had endured profound private pain and emotional weight in his life, and yet he continued to show warmth, care, and mentorship to those around him, especially children who needed guidance. Johnny has said that this model of resilience and dignity became a quiet compass for him, even years later, during his most difficult personal battles. Today, when Johnny speaks about Brian Keith, he does so not with nostalgia alone, but with deep respect and emotional clarity. Brian was not just a co-star. He was a stabilizing presence in a chaotic industry, a protector when Johnny needed guidance, and a model of grounded humanity behind an often imposing exterior. As Johnny Whitaker moved further into adulthood, his life began to shift dramatically. The structured environment of working on set was gone, and with it, the guidance and emotional steadiness he once received from Brian Keith. Johnny's transition into the adult world was not smooth, And like many child actors, the sudden absence of the routine and identity built around acting left him unsure of his place in life. The entertainment industry, which had once celebrated his innocence and emotional depth, now had different expectations and far fewer safety nets. During this period, the lessons he learned from Brian became both a source of strength and a reminder of what he had lost. The years following his early success were marked by personal struggle. Johnny had once been a bright presence on screen, confident, expressive, and emotionally present. But without clear direction, he found himself drifting. The pressure of sustaining a career in Hollywood after childhood success is something many young actors have struggled with, and Johnny was no exception. His marriage to Simria Wright in 1984 represented a sincere attempt to build a life of stability, but the internal challenges he faced began to weigh heavily on the relationship. The marriage lasted 4 years before ending in 1988, a separation that would mark the beginning of a difficult turning point in Johnny's life. At the same time, Brian Keith's own life had become increasingly burdened. Behind his tough on-screen image was a deeply emotional man who carried personal grief quietly. Brian's later years were marked by family tragedy and physical illness, and the weight of these hardships grew heavier over time. When Johnny later spoke about Brian, he acknowledged that the emotional strength he had admired in his mentor was something that had been hard-earned and at times painful. Keith was someone who cared deeply but struggled to express that care outwardly, a man whose silence often held more meaning than his words. Even after family affair ended, the connection between Johnny and Brian did not disappear immediately. Brian remained in contact, checking in and offering words of direction when he could. But both men were on their own journeys, and Hollywood, by nature, creates distance. Their paths eventually separated, a reality that Johnny would later reflect on with a mixture of gratitude and regret. He understood that the closeness they once shared was tied to a time neither could ever return to, yet the impact of that relationship never left him. Years later, when news of Brian Keith's death reached Johnny, the loss struck with the force of something deeply personal. Keith's passing in 1997 was not just the end of a chapter in television history, but the loss of a man Johnny had admired, trusted, and loved. He said he wept like a kid again, because the grief pulled him back to the child he once was, the boy who had looked up at Brian as both mentor and protector. For Johnny, Brian was never simply an actor who played a role in his life. He was family in a way that transcended scripts, contracts, and industry expectations. When reflecting on Brian's legacy, Johnny consistently emphasized the humanity behind the persona. Brian was not simply strong, he was thoughtful. He was not simply demanding, he was honest. He was not simply stern, he was deeply caring. And he showed that care in actions rather than words. Johnny often recalled one lesson in particular. If you don't feel it, the audience won't feel it. It wasn't just guidance for acting, it was advice for living. Brian understood that authenticity, emotional truth, and integrity were the foundations of meaningful work and meaningful life. This principle would guide Johnny long after the cameras stopped rolling. But despite the wisdom he carried with him, Johnny struggled through some of the darkest years of his life after his divorce. Without the emotional support he once found on set or in Brian's grounding presence, he faced his battles largely alone. What followed was a period marked by addiction and searching, a long and personal fight to reclaim control, identity, and purpose. Yet the story does not remain in that darkness. Johnny later spoke about how remembering Brian's quiet strength helped him confront his own challenges. Brian had endured private pain with dignity, and that example became a source of motivation. Johnny eventually entered recovery, rebuilt his life, and redirected his experience toward helping others who were struggling with the same battles he once faced. And in this way, Brian's influence continued, not through memory alone, but through action. The connection that began on a sitcom set in the late 1960s did not simply fade into history. It shaped the man Johnny became, not just the actor. The compassion Brian showed him, the discipline he taught him, and the quiet strength he exemplified continued to guide Johnny far beyond the screen. In the years that followed his recovery, Johnny Whitaker began to rebuild not only his career, but also the deeper sense of identity that had been overshadowed by early fame. He did this slowly, deliberately, and with a maturity shaped by the lessons of his past. One of the first steps was returning to the craft of storytelling, this time not as a child star, but as an adult grounded in authenticity. He gradually re-entered the entertainment world through radio, theater, and selective screen appearances, each project reflecting personal intention rather than the pressure to regain fame. In 2012, Johnny co-produced and co-hosted the Dr. Zoe and Johnny Show, a radio program that allowed him to speak with honesty and humor about life both inside and outside of Hollywood. Listeners responded to his sincerity. He was no longer speaking as a performer trying to maintain a public image. He was a man reflecting on the real lessons of success, loss, struggle, and resilience. A year later, in 2013, he performed on stage in To Kill a Mockingbird, portrayed in a professional theater environment that required precision and emotional discipline. His role was not large, but his presence carried quiet authority. It was a reminder that acting had always been more than a job for him. It was a craft rooted in emotional truth, the same truth Brian Keith once taught him to seek. Then, in 2016, Johnny appeared in Sigmund and the Sea Monsters for Amazon, the program that had first brought him widespread recognition decades earlier. This return was not an attempt to recapture childhood fame, but rather a gentle acknowledgement of his journey. It honored the past without trying to relive it. But perhaps the most meaningful part of Johnny's life after recovery had nothing to do with the entertainment industry at all. He chose to dedicate himself to helping others who were battling the same struggles he once fought. He became involved in addiction support and counseling, using his experience not as something to hide, but as a tool to guide others towards sobriety and stability. In doing so, he created a legacy not defined by TV credits or film roles, but by compassion, honesty, and resilience. The emotional heart of this chapter of Johnny's life always returns to Brian Keith. When Johnny speaks about Brian, he does so with clarity, depth, and a sense of understanding that only time can create. Brian was never perfect. He was a man who carried personal grief that few ever knew. He struggled silently, fought his own battles, and sometimes lived with emotional weight that was difficult to express. Yet to Johnny, Brian was a person who made him feel safe during a time when childhood was overshadowed by work schedules, camera setups, producers' expectations, and industry pressure. Brian was the one who slowed down between takes, who sat with him, who explained scenes not as instructions, but as moments of emotional truth. He gave Johnny a model of what genuine care looked like, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and real. And because of that, Brian's loss was deeply personal. Johnny has shared that when he learned of Brian's passing in 1997, he broke down in a way he had not expected. It forced him to confront that the person who helped anchor him, who gave him a sense of direction when he needed it most, was gone. But with time came understanding. Johnny realized that Brian had never been trying to teach him how to be a celebrity. He had been teaching him how to be a human being, to work with honesty, to speak with intention, to treat people as individuals, not roles, to live with emotional truth instead of performance. These are the lessons Johnny carried into his adult life, through pain, recovery, rebirth, and meaningful change. Today, when Johnny shares a real story of Brian Keith, it is not a dramatic revelation. It is a tribute to a man who gave without needing recognition, a tribute to a mentor who understood the importance of quiet guidance, a tribute to a father figure whose influence transcended the screen entirely. Johnny often says that if he could speak to Brian today, he would not talk about Hollywood, episodes, or fame. He would simply say, "Thank you. You gave me more than you knew." And perhaps that is the real story, not the story of television fame, but of a man who helped shape a life.